Context. That's the tool that we are about to look at now. So we spoke earlier of the pathway of preparation, and everything that we do at CST, I want to keep grounding it or anchoring it in the different stages of this process. Everything that we are seeking to teach you has to do with this. When we speak about the pathway of preparation, the goal, the main aim is what we said earlier, is we want to cut straight lines. We want to not say more or less than what our passage is saying. And for us to do that well, we will need to be equipped. We will need to be faithful in doing all the things along this path. It's what your handout is helping you with. A point to be made is that this pathway has to be followed systematically. It has to be followed systematically. That there's no way of getting to point number B before I have done my point number A kind of work. What we're talking about now is context, and context is a very fast thing that shows up. Because when you're dealing with your text, a very important thing to be able to accurately understand what that text is saying, what the author was communicating, what the original audience, right, well, these guys here, would have understood from what the author was writing. Very key and primary and initial thing is going to be the context of that particular passage. So here's our principle. Simply put, we must understand the context in order to see how the original audience understood the text. We must understand the context in order to see how the original audience understood the text. So when it comes to this text that you're looking at, Ecclesiastes in chapter 7, you're wanting to see it, hear it, first and foremost from the original people who read it. You're not coming over here to your audience, right? And for you to be able to see that, you need to be able to look at that through its context. So every passage that we have exists within a wider context. And if this is your passage, right, if this is your passage over here in the middle, it has other information that is around it, which is what we're referring to as context, that is going to be vital for you to be able to get the point of it. We speak of it, it's just the illustrations that have been handed down to us from the great CST people who have come before us. If you're looking at through a telescope, you're going to find it has two pieces to it, right? And you want to be able to look through the context, right, of that particular passage to be able to see more clearly what it is that you're looking at. The work of context is very much like that work of putting a telescope to your eyes and allowing for those realities that are in that context to inform how it is you are understanding that which you're looking at. You remove that telescope from your eye, what you're going to be seeing is something a little bit more hazy, something a little bit more unclear. But when you apply the tools of biblical context, you are aiding yourself, you are equipping yourself with the tools necessary of being able to rightly or accurately interpret or understand what the original audience would have understood from that passage. Okay, you guys know context. Throw out for me the three types of contexts that are there, or all the types of contexts that are there that you're familiar with. One, this is the nap hour, so I'll try and interact with you guys as much as possible. One, literary. Two, Biblical 3. Historical 4. Cultural. There you go. Why are we even doing this session? Spring training, guys. Spring training. We're going to put this to work as well later on. So, we must understand the context in order to see how the original audience understood the text. You'll find that the stuff we're doing here, it amuses me actually in some ways. It is exceedingly foundational. I don't want to call it basic. Basic sounds like it's simple. No, but it's exceedingly foundational. And you'll find that what our goals are for you and I are very modest goals. Let me tell you what the modest goals are. Our modest goals are for you, the next time you open the scriptures and begin to prepare a sermon, our modest goals are to cause you to pause. You know 844, we do the 844 thing. Literary context, historical, biblical, cultural, and ecofiti. That's an A. That's not the goal. The goal is not for people to say them well. The goal is for people to understand them well enough to be able to actually apply them. So that this becomes a habitual thing that you actually do when you're preparing a sermon. That you don't assume this stage you're talking about. That you actually approach your pathway of preparation systematically. Pastors, it's very easy for us to say the stuff we just said. But actually, when we open up the passage to prepare, time is short. You know, we need to keep going. I can make a lot of assumptions about what I already understand in this passage because, you know, I've been reading my Bible for a very long time, you know, and I'm not a regular member. I'm a pastor. I might even have gone to Bible school, you know, and I've listened to John Piper sermons even, you know. So I can approach the passage with a whole lot more confidence and not do the meticulous, difficult work of going step by step. So what our goal is a very modest one. Spring training, guys. It's the fundamentals. We want to get you to understand these tools, one, but two, actually do that the next time when you open up a passage and ask yourself, what kind of context is most relevant for my understanding this particular passage? Right? Not all the different contexts that we have just articulated will be of equal weight with each passage, but you certainly want to be evaluating and weighing each of those contexts as you're approaching your text to ask yourself, in what way does it inform my understanding of this passage? Okay, so one, literary context. Let's make sure that we're in the same place for this. Where do you go to find literary context? Where do you go to find this? Someone tell me. I know it's the obvious questions. It's just shout out where you are. Where do you go? You go to the text before and the text after. That's what we mean by literary context. What is the position of my text in the book that I'm reading? Its immediate positioning, the stuff that comes before it, the stuff that comes after it, but also the entire book, right? If the book especially has a very clear structure that it is actually set up in, if the book even has its argument that is structured with the structure of the whole book, it's going to be really important to understand the ways in which your particular passage fits in to that entire book and that entire argument that is found there. So what this means is you want to make yourself familiar with more than what you're reading. Pastor, what we've just said is something, again, simple. You remember, we don't want to be the pros who become so good at this, we forget these basics. So often, when we are preparing a sermon for people on Sunday, you will find that we sink just into the portion that we're preaching that particular Sunday. And sometimes we actually don't have much understanding of the passage that comes right after it. So it becomes something of extra work for us if we're going to faithfully preach Ephesians in chapter 3 that the way in which we are doing our sermon prep is not that we have actually no clue whatsoever what Ephesians chapter 4 says. So that next week when you preach Ephesians chapter 4, you're like, oh, now I think I understand what Ephesians chapter 3 was saying. One of our former instructors who came here, a brother called Rommel, has a simple little phrase that he just says, he tells preachers more often than anything else. He just says, just keep on reading. Just keep on. You get to the end of the section you're supposed to be, just keep on reading. It's such a simple thing, but it can be so transformative in aiding you to understand the passage that you're preaching. Do not underestimate the usefulness of literary context, historical context. What about this? Where do we go to find historical context? Somebody tell me. Yes, 1 year.
I think you can get news from us as the text itself.
Okay. What do we mean by historical context? Maybe a more basic question and more useful to ask. And once you understand it, then where do you go to get it? What's historical context? It's so complex, it's not a trick question. Yes, sir. Yeah. 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 So the people, place, and time is simply what you mean by historical context, right? It's really not more complex than that. It's history, right? Who are the people, right? Where were they? And what was happening in that particular time? That's simply what you're asking. It's a historical placing of your text. Who was this person writing? The person, right? Where was he and what time was that? Was it during COVID? Because if it was during COVID, we really understand what he means, right? When he's saying certain things. Even me, I felt it the same way. I get it, right? Oh, that's the time when this happened. It really changes a lot of the... Oh, movement was quite restricted actually during that time. We're speaking about barriers that were cordoning off Nairobi, right? As though it's a police state of sorts. And people could not be like, oh, I understand a bit more about that particular time. Now I get why he wrote that in that particular email. So it's simply history. So in the Bible, when you're talking about historical context, literary context, where do you go to? First and foremost, you go where? Before, after, and then the entire placing of the book. With the wisdom book that we're looking at, I think it's useful in some ways to see it as part of the wisdom books as a whole, and even the role that they play in the canon, to understand that when Paul is saying all the way down in 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 16, that all scripture is profitable, that part of the thing is saying of what profit the Bible has for us is the wisdom literature that we are speaking about. That we actually are ill-equipped to live the profitable lives that God is calling us to. Right? If we have neglected the wisdom literature, right, that has been given to us, which includes the book of Ecclesiastes, and just understanding, what role is this playing in the Christian's life, and why is this so important in their discipling, for them to follow Jesus well in this world. They will require this wisdom that can only come from it. So you're placing that literary. And then historical, quite well put, Davis, that the best place to get our historical context is from the book itself, right? So when the book itself tells you people, place, and time, just celebrate, right? That's just been handed over to you. That's not always as clear, right? I think you're going to find in the book of Ecclesiastes itself, there's going to be questions. I'll go to Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 1. Someone get there and read that for us very, very loudly. Ecclesiastes 1:1. Thank you. Okay, who is this? Who is speaking? What is his name? Who is speaking? What's his name? The preacher, man, staying on the line. I see, you didn't fall into my trap. Right? That's what it says. So, I think there's a lot of reasons in reading the book of Ecclesiastes to say this is likely Solomon. Right? He's a son of David. He was king over Israel. Right? He's known for his wisdom. He's known for his wealth. These are all things that are being said in the book. Solomon has written other books of wisdom, a whole bunch in Proverbs. Right? So as you're reading this, you're saying, this is very likely Solomon. But yet the book doesn't really get you that far. Because son of David could be another king. Right? So there's, you want to approach this in saying it is very likely Solomon. And I think there's a very strong argument to make for Solomon, one. And then two, you don't want to very lightly move away from a Solomonic authorship of this particular book. You want to be very hesitant to do that. But there are arguments that could be made. There's some people who will say that this actually has been written after the exile in Babylon. And they'll seek to make an argument for that. And the point we are making is that you cannot come out and dogmatically refute that particular position simply because the book that you're reading has not explicitly stated that it has actually been written by Solomon. So that you're saying, with my historical context, according to what I can see here, there are good reasons to believe that this has been written by Solomon. So, brothers, when it comes to that type of context, you want to go like, I know what I'm working with. This information of historical context is going to go a long way in helping me, but I want to likely keep whatever my main point is from the passage I'm preaching from being entirely reliant on something I cannot dogmatically be able to state from the text. Okay? Biblical context. Where are we going to find biblical context? Yes, sir?
I think
related passages in the Bible. Okay, so if I come across a passage in the book of Psalms that it speaks of grace. Ephesians chapter 2. Is that biblical context? Because that's also about grace. Mr. Raymond, let's do Raymond. Let me come here. Yeah. So that's the key, right? And this is the one that has tripped us up quite often, right? So when you're talking about the biblical context, you're only asking yourself the things that come before this particular point of revelation, not the things that come after. Right? So I was going to give you an exercise, which I won't now, of Psalm 77. And Psalm 77 is just like so many other Psalms, that has very strong allusions to the Exodus, right? And so sometimes the language of the Exodus shows up very explicitly and shining in your face. Sometimes it's just, a little slight, right, here and there. But in just reading it, you go like, yeah. An average Israelite reading this particular passage would immediately have gone like, that's Pharaoh, man. That's Pharaoh right there, right? And that would have been an allusion that he's making to something, right, that God has revealed in the scriptures that the audience had access to. So you're only looking at what has come before, not what has come after, right? So we said this before. We said when it comes to what comes after has its place. You remember our document, our pathway of preparation? Our pathway of preparation has that right here, right? That's what Pastor Musimi will be helping us with tomorrow, right? When it comes to getting to the cross, right? It's what we call theological reflection. We're going to be considering all manner of other things. So you want to make sure that in this first stage, right, that you're not doing your biblical theology work there. Your biblical theology work is really useful. But you remember this pathway of preparation is sequential. And so you want to wait until you've gotten your author's argument, And then you can start using your tools of biblical theology and other things here as you're getting now to the gospel, to ask yourself, in what way does the whole Bible come together? But you want to hold back first and do the work of context. What would the original audience have understood from this text before we do the next work? Okay? That's clear enough. There are certain books, like when we did Revelation last time, biblical context was just everything. I mean, the book of Revelation is just like pregnant with all manner of allusions. Not illusions, just to be clear, but allusions to things that have come before it. It's almost like it's the last book of the Bible or something, you know? That's just showing you all the things that have been said are coming to a grand conclusion. This is where it's always been headed, right? And so it's very hard to read through a couple of verses before being like, oh, that's Daniel, oh, that's Ezekiel. And especially of apocalyptic literature that comes before it. Okay, we won't take too much more time with that. Cultural, right? Someone tell me, what's the difference between cultural context and historical context? Just ask you to do a little bit more work there. The difference between cultural context and historical context. Yes, Mr. Eganjo. Okay, so the life context, and that's really the big thing to get out of that, right? It's what would the daily life have been, right? So it's not necessarily simply bound by a history. So if, for example, one University of Nairobi student is writing a text message, because they don't write letters, to another UON student, and they refer to a smocha. A smocha, our brothers from the coast do not know what that is. You know? Do you know what a smocha? Do you know? Or you were told by someone? You know a smocha? Tumeona vile tunaandika, mshaona, right? But it's a vital part of the culture at the university. Life revolves around, you know, a smocha. Or it was during my time, if I was in high school, and articulating a samosa and mandazi. If somebody reads that and just thinks it's a combination of two edible things, you're really missing the point. Because it is the height of joy that is only experienced by the wealthy amongst the student body, right? So it's elements of daily life, right? Daily life. And so in the Gospels, for example, that might be agriculture, right? Jesus might be speaking and he's sharing a parable and he says something about a sower, and the thing he's just raised there is just merely something that had to do with that particular time, right? But agriculture is just part of that culture, and there are certain social economic realities, right, that come along with that. So you want to be familiar with what cultural things are emerging from my text that I need to familiarize myself with, so that again I can be able to understand the passage that I am looking at. So this is distinct from historical context in that it does not relate to a particular audience in a particular place at a particular time, but the details of life that the people and characters in the text had in common. Okay, so to read that, make sure that we've nailed that. Okay, let's get to some work. Turn your Bibles to Ecclesiastes in chapter 11. Ecclesiastes in chapter 11. So, Ecclesiastes 11, I'll read a few verses. This is not one of your passages for your small group discussions. It is not. So, it says, cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a portion to 7 or 8, or even to 8. For you know not what disaster may happen on earth. If the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves on the earth. And if a tree falls to the south or to the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it will lie. He who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. Let's stop there. I'm going to finish it later. But question. This is your passage, and you've just opened it up. You just read that. Tell me, what kind of context immediately shouts out at you that you might need to go and find out what that means? What phrase is suggesting to you there something about context that you're like, yep, I can, from Nairobi, Kenya, I need some help. Yeah.
Cultural context, the first line, casting bread upon the water.
Yeah. So that's clearly telling me there's something I don't get. My daily life has very little to do with casting bread on water. Maybe that's just my life. I don't know about yours. So when you read that, you're like, there's something here I'm clearly not understanding. And it's likely something related to culture that I need to be able to grasp. And for me to be able to rightly understand and preach this particular passage, I'll need to do some research, some work, to be able to get a better understanding of that. When you're doing work like this, you, again, want to rely always, when it comes to anything with context, your option number one, that is always your best and most reliable option, is the Bible. That's not always where you will find all your answers, but that's oftentimes where you want to start off with. And go like, oh, there's another book which speaks about the same thing, and this is very similar. So use the Bible to interpret the Bible, and that's oftentimes your best bet. And once you leave that, I'd say study as broadly as you can. Right? A good study Bible is a good friend for things like this. And yet my primary advice for studies like this is you want to look at more than one resource when you're studying out something like cultural context. You, as the interpreter of the passage, have the responsibility at the end of the day. You will not point to another authority and blame him for what you're going to say. You're the one who will give an account for what you're going to say. So study broadly and arrive at a faithful conclusion that you really believe is faithful to the text that is in front of you. So, cast your bread upon many waters. Of the multiple ideas of what this could be, I think one of the most credible understandings of what's going on here is how they would speak of trade in those days. And the exhortation here would be one that is connected to putting grain on ship, right, and sending it out to different trading points. And the exhortation there then becomes a businessman, what he does in his investments, in his ventures, is he casts grain, right, on multiple ship, right, in the sea, and they all go off to different trading ports without him having very clear certainty of what will actually return a profit and what will not return a profit. The posture that he would have as he's making that investment would be a posture that embraces risk, would be a posture that at a very minimum, and especially this passage, does not guarantee outcome. So when you're reading through this, however it is that you're articulating this, right, you want to understand that this casting bread on waters is something that is speaking of the lack of guaranteed results and likely pointing to how it is that they would do business by putting grain on ship and sending it out. You will notice that that understanding of casting bread on many waters connects in very many ways to the entire book of Ecclesiastes and even this particular portion, where the author is trying again to convince us over and 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 over again that life is a breath. Don't try approach it as though it is a formulaic, right, thing where if you simply do 1, 2, 3, you will absolutely get, right, 4, 5, 6. That's not how right, the order of reality in which you are operating actually works. It is a whole lot more elusive. And so he's speaking here by drawing an illustration of business and going like, you see how the businessmen operate? They cast grain on the waters and they send them out without certainty. If you keep on reading the rest of it, right, give a portion to 7 or even to 8, for you know not what disaster may happen on earth. Colloquial wisdom, as we say it nowadays, is to say, don't put all your eggs in one basket. You know, this sounds way more poetic than eggs in one basket. But that's really the gist of what he's driving at with his exhortation here to cast your bread upon the waters. If you keep on reading, verse 4, see what he says there? He who observes the wind will not sow. That invitation to taking risk that is spoken of in verse 1, right, is clearly being affirmed by the things that are following after. He who observes the wind, right, will not sow. So again, we are looking at an illustration of agriculture, right? And I don't know if you know these guys, right, who can look outside and tell you it will rain today at 3:45 p.m. Ever met those guys? Where the clouds are thick and hanging over your head and they look up and say, yeah, itanyesha hii. You know, with such confidence. And these guys always scare me. I'm not sure that's a skill you just develop. It seems like there's something else that's going on there. In an agrarian society, right, when it rains, my goodness, it's everything, isn't it? Like if the rains are late and you planted your seed, it rots in the ground. That's gone. So there's a risk there. But then there's another option of wait until you're completely certain that it's going to rain this week on Friday, and therefore you can start all your cultivation work on Monday because you're certain that the rain will come on. And he says, yeah, no, it doesn't work like that. If that's you, you are waiting for certainty before you embark on that venture. You will never sow. You will never reap. I think even better is how it says it, right? You will never get that harvest because you're waiting for a certain kind of certainty. And then the last 2 verses there. As you do not know the way, the Spirit comes into the bones of the womb of a woman with child. So you do not know the work of God who makes everything. See what he's trying to teach us there? Don't try and have the same kind of knowledge that only God can have. The same kind of certainty of outcome that only God has before you embark on a venture. Only God has that. So it is quite appropriate for you to actually approach life with this cast your bread in many waters, like the businessman does, of one who sows that seed without certainty of exactly when rain will come. Verse 5, verse 6, in the morning sow your seed, and at evening withhold not your hand, for you do not know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good. Little example there of a way in which articulating or understanding cultural context, which is this idea of grain being cast on waters, is actually useful and affirming in understanding the rest of the passage. Now, I want you to do an exercise for yourselves. Go to Ecclesiastes in chapter 7. Another passage you're not doing, at least the passage that we're reading. Ecclesiastes in chapter 7. Let me read for you from verse 27. Behold, this is what I have found, says the preacher, while adding one thing to another, to find the scheme of things which my soul has sought repeatedly, but I have not found. One man among 1,000, I have found. But a woman, among all these, I have not found. The end. One man among 1,000. Righteous, good. That I've found. But a woman, I haven't. I want you to work with your neighbor to use the tools of biblical context to spare you from preaching on Sunday a sermon that men are better than women. Because you could be having a textual application there that's saying, even Solomon said, and he was the wisest of them all. Find a neighbor. You might want to find the right neighbor for this work, lest you come back with the wrong conclusion. Biblical context, we've talked about all of them. You have a verse there. Do some work. Come back. Okay. Let's come on back. I could have charged you with, first of all, coming up with terrible sermon titles from those verses. But I don't even think I want us to joke about it, just because of how bad it is in our society. And how, even though nobody will say it that explicitly, we live in a world where our ladies, whether it's our daughters or our mothers, will actually experience a lack of respect. So we certainly don't want to say that. So tell me, how are you convincing me that that passage doesn't actually say that from the work you've done with context? Is there no hands up? Are you not convinced by? So this is me being confident that you can apply these tools. Ama, you want 5 more minutes? You want more time? Pastor Mbonisi? So good. So verse 26, yeah?
We think the author might be Solomon. And then there's a cross-reference in the Bible to 1 Kings 11.
Excellent. So you used a cross-reference to 1 Kings 11. And did you go there? Verse 3, that is? You want to read that for us? So Pastor Mbonisi has told us 2 things already. One is pointed us to verse 26, literary context. And verse 26 is speaking of a certain kind of woman. Right? Likely a prostitute or one who is ensnaring others. So it's not a statement just generally about women, likely about a certain kind of women. But then you've taken us to another portion. Yeah.
Solomon, he had 700 wives who were princesses and 300 concubines.
Okay. Why is that useful?
Well, 700 plus 300 comes to 1,000.
Okay.
And Solomon's wives led him astray.
Yeah. And why is 1,000 important?
Because it's the one in 1,000.
Are you seeing that? Are we following? You know, we might be having a conversation here and we're together. We're together, everyone. So 1 Kings 11:3, speaking of Solomon's wife, so we're saying it's very likely, is the language we're using, that the author of this book is very likely Solomon. A passage like this really seems to tend itself towards that direction. You know, a bit more in the historical context, even amongst those who say it was written post-exile. You know, there's some of those who will still say that author wrote it to sound like it was Solomon, not because he's lying, but as a literary device. Hence why he would still use this. So this would still be a very legitimate place to go to understand this. And the Solomons and his wives, concubines plus wives, 1,000. And here it's saying 1,000. So how would that help you articulate that this is not a statement about How would you frame that? That this is not a statement that, you know, men are righteous, women are wicked, or generally men are more righteous than women. How would what you've just stated help you avoid that particular pitfall?
I think it's more about the choices Solomon made and the harm he gathered rather than women getting a men.
So good. Yeah, so context-wise, you're preaching that, and you're wanting to understand this from the context of the person who is likely writing, right, which is Solomon. And articulating that this is very likely Solomon describing his experience, right, as opposed to Solomon making a statement broadly about gender. Anybody else with anything useful that came out of context? Yes, sir. Verse 20, very useful. You want to read that for us very loudly?
Verse 20 says, surely there is not a righteous man on earth who does good and never sins.
Okay. That sounds like broader category than just merely speaking about women. So that the general statement that he's speaking about is about the sinfulness of man. I should have been asking you that question as opposed to even stating it, right? That the passage that is broader, the context, is speaking about the sinfulness of man more generally, and he's making application in his own life about what his experience has been. So this is not a statement again on gender, but his understanding and experience of the fallen nature of man. Anything else that's useful that emerged out there from context? Yes. Brother Andy. Yeah.
Verse 28 and then verse 28 structure.
Yeah.
Sustainable upright man among 1,000, among 1,000 women or 1,000 men. But changes there, but not 100 among not 1,000 and more. So whether is there anything going on as far as just how the verse is structured? Anything to benefit from it? Is there anything?
I'm more sure I'm understanding the question, brother.
So I'm asking,
Yeah.
the verse is structured.
Yeah.
Is there anything that this is poetry and parallelism? Is there anything that we could use parallelism to help us there or not? I don't understand.
Yeah, I personally don't think so. But if there's someone else who has insight on that, whether this is actually parallelism, I'd be very happy to hear how he sees that as putting forth a truth that is currently not evident. Is the Bible you're using framing, has it structured this part as poetry? Or is it just stating it as normal prose? Does anybody have a version that yours has?
Yeah, looking at verse number 26.
Yeah.
And even as dangerous as that first woman is, the truth here that comes out is that the one can avoid the trap only who fears the Lord. So as if you are, the fear of the Lord will lead you out of those traps.
Yeah, see, this alone I have found that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. So if you read from verse 20, as far back up as we've been taken, and you read also the very last verse of that particular context, it all seems to be quite clear what it is emphasizing. And that last verse again, if you could read it, it says, see, this alone I have found. This is his conclusion of everything he's been saying. That God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. So he's speaking more generally and more broadly about the depravity of man and his experience in his failure when it comes especially to his relationship with women as being a place where he has experienced that fallenness so starkly. So context is very useful. I do think the reference to 1,000 and 1,000 is quite glaring and starkly in our faces as being yet another reason for us to think this is very likely Solomon, or authored to sound like Solomon. So guys, that's the principle, right? We must understand the context in order to see how the original audience would have understood that particular text. Any other questions before we move away from context? Questions? We have 0 minutes. There's a hand here. Yes, sir. That's a useful thing to do, brother. So if you're starting off with step number 1, which is the text, reading multiple translations to ensure that you're not simply stumbling over the English that you're looking at is a very good thing to do as a step number 1 with the text that you're handling before you even begin applying any other tools.